Dawn crept across Morgan Creek Ranch like a held breath. Caleb Morgan watched his boys move through morning chores in practiced silence, their movements mechanical as clockwork dolls. 2 years. 2 years since Sarah's fever took her, and with her went their voices, their laughter, their light. Eli, 12 now, fed the horses without whistling. Jonah, barely 9, gathered eggs with careful hands that once threw them at fence posts for sport. The only sounds were boots on hardwood, tin plates on pine table, the scrape of spoons against bowls. Caleb's weathered hands trembled around his coffee cup. His boys ate their biscuits and gravy like phantoms, eyes downcast, souls somewhere unreachable. The Winchester by the door couldn't protect against this enemy the suffocating silence that had claimed his home. Outside, wild roses bloomed untended by Sarah's grave. Inside, 3 hearts beat in isolation, prisoners in their own grief-stricken bodies. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. The late afternoon sun painted Red Hollow's depot platform in shades of amber and dust. Caleb Morgan stood at the edge of the wooden planking, his worn Stetson turning slowly in his calloused hands. He'd come to town for supplies, nothing more. But Mrs. Henderson's gossip at the mercantile had pulled him here like iron filings to a magnet. "Been sitting there 3 days now," she'd whispered over the pickle barrel. "That deaf woman in the wedding dress? Man who was supposed to marry her took one look when she stepped off the train and lit out like his tail was on fire." There she was. Amelia Hart sat on a leather trunk, her once white wedding dress torn at the hem and stained with travel dust. Her posture remained impossibly straight, chin lifted despite the curious stares from passing townsfolk. Kid gloves with pearl buttons lay folded in her lap. She held a small slate and chalk, writing something with careful precision. Caleb approached slowly, boots announcing his presence on the weathered boards. She looked up, eyes the color of prairie sky after rain, alert and intelligent despite the weariness etched in their corners. No fear there, just assessment. He gestured to the bench beside her trunk, asking permission. She nodded once, economical and graceful. Station Master Pruitt watched from his window, telegraph key clicking disapproval in Morse code. The whole town would know within the hour that Caleb Morgan was talking to the abandoned bride. Caleb pulled a pencil stub from his vest pocket, turned over a supply receipt. His letters came slow and crooked. "My boys need help. Lost their mother 2 years back. Haven't spoken since." Amelia read, her expression softening almost imperceptibly. She wrote on her slate in flowing script, "I can teach, I can work, I don't need pity." "Not offering pity," Caleb wrote back. "Offering a position, governess, teacher, room, board, fair wage." She studied him for a long moment. Her fingers traced the torn lace at her sleeve. This dress that was meant for a beginning had become an ending. Or perhaps, her eyes seemed to say as they moved from his earnest face to his work-roughened hands, another kind of beginning entirely. The slate appeared again. When? Now, if you're willing. Mr. Pruitt had emerged from his office, hovering near the door with manufactured concern. "Mr. Morgan, perhaps the lady needs—" Caleb stood, his full height cutting off Pruitt's meddling. He offered Amelia his hand. She took it, rising with a dignity that made her torn dress look like a queen's robes. Together, they loaded her single trunk onto his wagon bed. As the buckboard rolled away from the depot, Amelia pulled a small notebook from her carpet bag. She wrote carefully, then showed him, "Your boys, what are their names?" "Eli and Jonah," he said aloud, forgetting she couldn't hear. He took the notebook, added, "Good boys, just lost." She nodded, understanding filling her eyes. She knew about being lost. The difference was, she'd learned to navigate silence by choice. Perhaps she could teach his boys to find their way through the silence that had chosen them. The road stretched toward Morgan Creek Ranch. toward whatever strange salvation two broken families might build together. Behind them, the depot grew small, taking with it the woman who'd waited to be rescued. Ahead lay only the unknown, and for the first time in 2 years, Caleb felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Amelia faced forward, the wedding veil she'd tucked in her bag forgotten. The torn dress didn't matter anymore. She had work to do, children to teach, a life to rebuild from the ashes of abandonment. Her hands folded calmly in her lap, but Caleb caught the slight lift at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the promise of one. The wagon rolled on through the sage and rabbit brush, carrying 2 souls who'd learned that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose when fate leaves you no other choice. The setting sun painted their silhouettes against the endless sky, a weathered rancher and a woman in white, heading home to boys who needed exactly the kind of voice that makes no sound. Behind them, dust settled over their tracks. Ahead, Morgan Creek Ranch waited, silent and ready for the profound changes that come when desperate hearts decide to risk everything on an impossible chance. The horses knew the way home. Caleb let them lead, his hands steady on the reins, stealing glances at the remarkable woman who'd agreed to enter their grief and try to transform it into something else, something that might, eventually, include joy. As they crested the final rise before the ranch came into view, Amelia touched his sleeve gently, pointed to a meadowlark singing on a fence post. She signed something he didn't understand yet, but would learn meant beautiful. He nodded, understanding without words. Yes, it was beautiful. The bird, the evening, the unexpected hope sitting beside him in a torn wedding dress. Maybe, just maybe, they could teach each other how to speak again. The ranch dogs heard them first. Their barking echoed across the valley as the wagon crested the final hill, Morgan Creek Ranch spreading below them in the purple dusk. Caleb felt Amelia stiffen beside him, her hands tightening on her carpetbag. He wanted to reassure her. But what could he say that she would understand, that she could hear? The main house sat low and sturdy, built from local timber and determination. Smoke drifted from the chimney Eli had started supper, responsible boy that he was. The lean-to addition on the east side would be Amelia's room, private enough for propriety but close enough for safety. Everything looked exactly as Caleb had left it that morning. Yet somehow the presence of the woman beside him made it all appear foreign, like seeing his own life through a stranger's eyes. Blue and Patch, the ranch dogs, came running full tilt, then slowed as they neared the wagon. Amelia extended one gloved hand, palm down, perfectly still. Blue approached first, tail tentative, nose working. Whatever he smelled seemed to satisfy him. His tail began wagging properly, and Patch followed suit. Caleb watched, amazed. These dogs barely tolerated the monthly visits from Mrs. Henderson. The front door opened. Eli stood silhouetted against the lamplight, Jonah's smaller form half hidden behind his brother's legs, even from 50 yards. Caleb could see Eli's body go rigid with shock. The boy's hand moved protectively to Jonah's shoulder. Caleb brought the wagon to a stop near the porch. The silence felt heavier than the travel trunk he lifted from the bed. Amelia climbed down unassisted, her movements graceful despite the torn dress and obvious exhaustion. She stood very still, letting the boys look their fill, making no sudden movements that might startle them. Smart woman. She understood something about wounded creatures. "Boys," Caleb said, his voice rough. "This is Miss Amelia Hart. She's come to help us, to teach you." Eli's face darkened with something between betrayal and fury. His lips pressed tight, the same expression Sarah used to make when upset. Jonah pressed harder against his brother's legs, one eye peeking around to stare at the stranger in the ruined white dress. Amelia set down her carpetbag with deliberate slowness. She raised both hands where the boys could see them clearly, then brought her fingertips to her chin and moved her hand forward and down a graceful, gentle motion. She repeated it twice more, patient as sunrise. Caleb had no idea what she was doing until she pointed to herself, then to each of them, and repeated the gesture. "Hello." She was saying hello in her own language. the language of hands and air and meaning without sound. Jonah's eye grew wider. His small hand emerged from behind Eli's back, fingers trying to copy the movement, clumsy, uncertain, but unmistakably attempting to return her greeting. Caleb's chest tightened. It was the first voluntary communication his youngest had made since the funeral. Eli grabbed Jonah's hand, stopping him. The older boy's eyes blazed with protective anger, daring this stranger to hurt them, to leave them, to be another loss they couldn't bear. Amelia seemed to understand. She stepped back, giving them space, then picked up her carpet bag and waited. Just waited, calm as a mountain lake, for Caleb to show her where she belonged in this careful chaos of grief. The lean-to room, Caleb managed, leading her around the side of the house. The door stuck, it always had, requiring a sharp shoulder push. Inside, the small space held a rope bed with a cornhusk mattress, a washstand, a trunk for clothes, and a rag rug one of Sarah's church friends had made years ago. Muslin sheets hung on pegs, and a small window faced east toward the sunrise. Amelia set her bag on the bed, ran her hand over the quilt, another of Sarah's pieces, the wedding ring pattern in blues and yellows. She turned to Caleb and nodded once. It would do. He backed out, giving her privacy to settle in, and returned to face his sons. They hadn't moved from the doorway. Eli's jaw worked like he wanted to speak, to demand answers, to rage against this change, but the words stayed locked inside, prisoners of his grief. Jonah had retreated fully behind his brother again, but Caleb had seen that small hand trying to speak. That was something. That was everything. Supper was beans and cornbread. Same as every night, Caleb didn't manage to shoot something fresh. They sat at the pine table. 4 souls around a space meant for 4, yet the configuration felt wrong. Sarah's chair held Amelia now. Though she'd tried to take Caleb's usual spot instead, he'd guided her firmly to Sarah's place. No point pretending otherwise, that chair had been empty long enough. She ate neatly, economically, despite what must have been days of barely managing meals at the depot. The boys watched her from under their lashes, suspicious and curious in equal measure. When she reached for the salt, her sleeve pulled back, revealing a dark bruise on her wrist. Eli saw it too. Caleb watched his son's expression shift from anger to something more complicated. After the meal, Amelia rose and began clearing plates. Eli jumped up to stop her. This was his job, his responsibility. She stepped back immediately, hands open in apology. Then, slowly, she signed something, pointed to him, made a gesture over her heart, pointed to the plates, and nodded with what looked like approval. Even without understanding the exact words, the meaning was clear. She recognized his role, respected it. Eli's shoulders relaxed a fraction. He took the plates to the wash basin while Amelia watched. When he was done, she signed something else, brought her fingertips together, then moved them toward him. She repeated it, patient as before, until Jonah suddenly darted forward and copied the gesture perfectly. Thank you. She was teaching them to say thank you. Caleb's throat burned. Such a simple thing. Those 2 words his boys used to scatter like seeds throughout their days. Please and thank you and I love you. Mama all gone into the ground with Sarah. But here was this stranger in her torn wedding dress, pulling language from the air with graceful hands, offering his sons a way to speak without betraying their vow of silence. The coal oil lamps needed trimming. The horses needed their evening grain. The mundane chores of ranch life continued around this small miracle of communication. Amelia pulled out her slate, wrote, "May I teach them more?" Caleb nodded, not trusting his voice. She smiled then, the first real smile he'd seen from her, transforming her face from merely pretty to something luminous. She turned to the boys, holding up one finger, one more word for tonight. Her hands came together, fingertips touching, then spread apart and down. She repeated it while pointing to the doorway of her room, to herself, to the gesture. Good night. Jonah copied it immediately, his small hands precise in their mimicry. Eli resisted longer, but finally, reluctantly, his hands formed the shape. Good night, they said without sound. Good night to this stranger who was already becoming something else. Amelia signed it back to each of them, then moved toward her room. At the doorway, she turned back. Her hands moved in a new pattern, fingers spread, hand moving over her heart, then gesturing to encompass all of them. Caleb didn't know what it meant, but something in her eyes translated it clearly enough. Thank you for taking a chance on me. The lean-to door closed softly. Caleb sat with his boys in the lamplight, watching their hands practice the shapes of greeting, gratitude, and farewell. Outside, coyotes called across the valley. Inside, for the first time in 2 years, the silence felt different, not empty, but waiting, not broken, but preparing to transform into something new. Jonah's hands moved through the 3 signs again. Hello. Thank you. Good night. His face concentrated as a young scholar's. Eli watched his brother, and Caleb caught the older boy's hands twitch, wanting to join in but held back by the weight of being 12 and angry and afraid to hope. She seems kind, Caleb said carefully. Eli's eyes flashed to his father's face, searching for something. Permission, maybe, or a promise that this wouldn't be another loss. Caleb couldn't give him that promise. All he could offer was the truth. She needs our help too, he said. She's lost things, same as us. Eli considered this, then slowly, deliberately, brought his fingertips to his chin and moved his hand forward and down. Hello. He signed to the empty air, to the possibility of tomorrow, to the strange hope wearing a torn wedding dress that had come to rest under their roof. Outside, full dark had settled over Morgan Creek Ranch. Inside, 3 sets of hands practiced speaking without words, learning the first vocabulary of their new life, in her room. Amelia unpacked her few belongings, hanging the ruined wedding dress on a peg where it would dry into whatever came next. The rooster's crow found Amelia already in the kitchen, her movements silent as moth wings. Caleb stopped in the doorway, watching her work the coffee grinder with practiced efficiency. She'd found Sarah's apron, the blue one with tiny yellow flowers, and tied it around her waist. The sight should have hurt, but somehow it didn't. She moved differently than Sarah had, more deliberate. Each gesture conscious and complete. She turned, sensing his presence, and signed something he didn't recognize yet. Then she pointed to the coffee pot, raised her eyebrows in question. He nodded, and she poured him a cup, black as he liked it, though she couldn't have known his preference. Lucky guess. Or had she noticed the absence of cream pitchers yesterday? The boys emerged as the sun painted the kitchen gold through flour sack curtains. They stopped short, seeing Amelia at the stove, scrambling eggs in the cast-iron skillet Sarah had seasoned for 15 years. Jonah's hand found Eli's sleeve, but their wariness had shifted overnight. Less fear now, more curiosity. Amelia turned from the stove, signed good morning one of last night's lessons, and returned to cooking. Such a simple thing, not forcing interaction, just being present in their space, letting them choose when to engage. Eli signed it back first, stiff and formal. Jonah copied his brother, then added a small wave. Amelia's smile bloomed like spring after drought, but she kept it contained, not overwhelming them with her pleasure at their response. Breakfast was different. Not the food, eggs and biscuits and preserved peaches from last summer's canning, but the atmosphere. The boys watched Amelia's hands constantly, fascinated by how she communicated everything without sound. Pass the salt became a graceful point and beckoning gesture. More coffee. A raised pot and tilted head. Everything had become a conversation of movement. When plates were cleared and washed, Eli maintaining his territory at the wash basin while Amelia dried, she produced a slate and chalk from her room. She set them on the pine table with the ceremony of a preacher laying out communion elements. From her carpet bag came a thin book, worn at the edges, a manual alphabet and basic signs for the deaf and mute. She opened it to the first page, showing hand positions for each letter of the alphabet. Then she pointed to herself and slowly finger-spelled Amelia. The boys leaned forward, absorbed. She did it again, slower, having them copy each letter. Jonah's tongue poked out in concentration, the same expression he used to have when Sarah taught him his letters 2 years ago. Next came simple words. She would sign something, then point to the object: cup, table, window, door. Each sign was different. Cup was one hand curved like holding something, lifted toward the mouth. Table was both arms flat, one crossing over the other. Window was two hands vertical, one rising like a sash. Door was two hands flat, one swinging open. Jonah absorbed everything like drought-broken soil drinking rain. His hands flew through the signs, pointing at objects around the kitchen, demanding their names in this new language. Spoon Amelia showed him. Stove. She demonstrated the sign, then had him feel the heat from a safe distance to connect sensation with symbol. Eli participated reluctantly, his movements careful and controlled, as if too much enthusiasm might betray the grief he'd wrapped around himself like armor. But when Amelia showed them the sign for father thumb of an open hand tapping the forehead, something in his face cracked slightly. He looked at Caleb and made the sign perfectly. Caleb's eyes burned. Such a simple thing, being named by his son's hands. "Now you," Eli said aloud. Then caught himself, pressing his lips tight. The first words he'd spoken in 2 years, and they'd escaped by accident. Amelia didn't react to the slip, simply pointed to Caleb. Then demonstrated the signs slowly. He copied them, clumsy as a bear trying to dance. The boys laughed not out loud, but their shoulders shook and their eyes sparkled with suppressed mirth. When was the last time he'd seen them even close to laughing? The lesson continued. Horse, two fingers of one hand straddling the edge of the other hand. Sun, a circle drawn in the air above the head. Rain, both hands wiggling downward. Each sign built their vocabulary, constructed a bridge between their silence and the world around them. Then Amelia showed them something that made Eli's careful control finally crack. She pointed to him, then to Jonah, and made a sign, both hands in fists with index fingers extended, one higher than the other, brought together. "Brothers." She repeated it, having them face each other while making the sign. Eli's hands shook as he formed it. Brother. Such a loaded word, carrying all the games they used to play, the fights over nothing, the comfort after nightmares. He signed it toward Jonah, and the younger boy's face lit up like sunrise. Jonah signed it back, then threw himself at Eli, arms wrapping tight around his brother's middle. Caleb turned away, ostensibly to refill his coffee, actually to hide the tears that wouldn't stop coming. When he turned back, Amelia was teaching them sister, then mother. The boys' faces went still at that one. She quickly moved on to friend, pointing to herself with a question in her eyes. Were they friends yet? Jonah nodded immediately, signing friend with enthusiasm. Eli took longer, but eventually made the sign. Small and careful, but genuine. The morning lesson might have continued, but a meadowlark landed on the fence post visible through the kitchen window. Its yellow breast caught the sun as it sang, throat vibrating with music none of them could share with Amelia. But she saw it, pointed, and made a sign, both hands linked by thumbs, fingers fluttering like wings. "Bird," Jonah said aloud, then clapped his hand over his mouth, eyes wide with shock at his own voice. The room froze. Eli stared at his brother. Caleb gripped the back of a chair. Amelia remained perfectly still, not wanting to spook the moment. Then Jonah signed bird and pointed at the meadowlark. He signed it again, grinning. Then he spoke. Deliberately this time. "Bird. It's a bird. Papa." His voice was rusty from disuse, but clear. Caleb dropped into the chair, tears streaming openly down his weathered face. "Yes, son. It's a bird." Jonah ran to him, signing and speaking in a jumbled rush. "The bird is yellow. Pretty bird. Morning bird." 2 years of stored words tumbled out, punctuated by signs he was still learning, creating his own bridge between silence and sound. Eli stood apart, watching his brother's dam burst. Amelia moved closer to the older boy, not touching, but present. She signed something Caleb didn't understand yet, but Eli seemed to. The boy's throat worked, and finally, quietly, It's a meadowlark, Jonah, Mama's favorite. The mention of Sarah didn't shut them down as it had for 2 years. Instead, Jonah nodded enthusiastically. Mama's bird, he said, then signed mother and bird together. Amelia pulled out her slate, wrote quickly, "Would you like to learn beautiful morning?" Caleb read it aloud for the boys. They nodded, and she taught them one hand circling the face for beautiful, then the sign for morning, one arm cradled in the other, the upper hand rising like the sun. Beautiful morning. They practiced together, all 4 of them, hands moving in unison. The meadowlark sang outside. The morning sun climbed higher, flooding the kitchen with light that caught on the preserving jars lined on shelves, the McGuffey readers gathering dust, Sarah's quilting frame by the window with a half-finished project still stretched across it. "Beautiful morning," Jonah said aloud while signing. "It is a beautiful morning." Eli didn't speak, not yet, but his hands moved fluently through the signs. He looked at Amelia and signed, "Thank you," then added another sign she must have taught him when Caleb wasn't watching, pulling his flat hand away from his chin. "You're welcome," she signed back. The butter churn stood unused in the corner. They'd been buying butter from Mrs. Henderson since Sarah died. Amelia pointed to it, questioning. Caleb nodded, and she began teaching them the sign for butter, for milk, for the simple tasks that make a life. By the time the sun was fully up, warming the ranch with promise, they had a vocabulary of 30 signs. More importantly, Jonah had found his voice again, using it carefully but without fear, accompanied by hands that danced meaning into the air. Eli remained mostly silent, but his eyes had lost their shuttered look. He watched Amelia with something approaching trust. "School," Amelia signed, pointing to the slate, the books, making a question of it. "Yes," both boys said together, Jonah aloud. "Eli in sign." She smiled that transformative smile and began planning the next lesson, chalk dancing across slate. Caleb watched his family, for that's what they were becoming. Navigate this new world where silence and sound could coexist, where grief might soften into memory, where a stranger in a torn wedding dress could teach them all how to speak the language of hope. The meadowlark sang once more before flying away. Jonah signed bird again, just because he could, and Caleb signed back beautiful, because it was all of it. The morning, the bird, his boys learning to live again, and the remarkable woman who'd brought language back to their silent home. 2 weeks had passed in a rhythm of signs and careful words. The morning started like any other, Jonah chattering in his rediscovered voice while his hands flew through signs. Eli responding mostly in gestures, but occasionally letting a word slip. Amelia moved between stove and table with the easy efficiency of someone who belonged. That's when they heard the horses. Caleb looked up from his coffee, recognizing the measured pace of Sheriff Dawson's mare, but there was another horse too. Through the window, he saw the sheriff's familiar figure, his star pin catching the morning sun, and beside him rode Tom Garrett, Silas Boone's lawyer from Fort Bryer. "Boys, go check on the horses," Caleb said, but Eli was already at the window. "It's the sheriff," Eli said aloud, more words than he'd strung together in days. His hands moved to sign to Amelia. "Lawman, here." Amelia's face paled, but her hands remained steady as she signed back, "I understand." Sheriff Dawson knocked a courtesy, since everyone had seen him coming. Caleb opened the door, noting how the sheriff's weathered face looked uncomfortable, apologetic even. Dawson was a good man, had been at Sarah's funeral, had brought food those first terrible weeks. "Caleb," the sheriff said, removing his hat. "Sorry to disturb your morning. This is Mr. Garrett from Fort Bryer. We need to discuss some concerns that have been raised." Garrett didn't remove his hat. He was a thin man with the kind of mustache that required wax and attention, his suit too fine for ranch country. His eyes swept the room, lingered on Amelia, then dismissively moved on. "Perhaps we should speak privately," Garrett suggested, his voice carrying the kind of education that came from Eastern schools. "Nothing that needs saying can't be said in front of my family," Caleb replied. feeling Eli and Jonah press closer to Amelia. Garrett's mouth tightened at the word family. Very well. My client, Mr. Silas Boone, has raised serious concerns about the arrangements here. An unmarried woman living with a widower and his children. The impropriety alone. Miss Hart is employed as a governess and teacher. Caleb interrupted. She has private quarters. Everything is proper. Is it? Garrett pulled out a sheaf of papers from his leather satchel. The red wax seals official and threatening. Mr. Boone suggests otherwise. Furthermore, he questions whether a deaf woman can properly supervise children. What if there were an emergency of fire? How would she alert them to danger? Eli's hands clenched into fists. Jonah moved to stand directly in front of Amelia, small body radiating protection. Mr. Boone's concern is touching, Caleb said dryly. Considering he's never shown interest in my boy's welfare before. Sheriff Dawson shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving to rest on the pearl handle of his Colt .45, a nervous habit, not a threat. Caleb, I'm required to investigate any complaint regarding child welfare. You understand that? What I understand, Caleb said slowly, is that Silas Boone has been trying to buy my water rights for 3 years, and now, suddenly, he's concerned about propriety. Garrett smiled thinly. Mr. Boone is prepared to make a generous offer for your ranch, enough to relocate somewhere more suitable for raising children, perhaps back east, where the boys could attend proper schools. Amelia had been reading lips, following the conversation. She pulled out her slate, wrote quickly, and showed it to Caleb. He wants your land. I can speak for myself, Eli said suddenly, his voice cracking but determined. The room went still. Eli hadn't spoken to anyone outside the family since Sarah's funeral. Miss Amelia is teaching us. We're learning more from her than we ever did at the town school. The boy speaks, Garrett said with false surprise. How touching. And yet, living with a woman of questionable reputation. That's when Eli exploded into motion. Not violence, Sarah had raised him better, but his hands flew through signs with furious energy. And his voice, rusty but fierce, translated, She belongs here. She's good and kind, and she makes Jonah laugh, and she's teaching us to talk with our hands, and she makes Papa smile, and you can't take her away. The flood of words seemed to surprise Eli as much as anyone. He stood panting, glaring at Garrett with all the righteous fury a 12-year-old could muster. Jonah stepped forward, chin raised. In a clear voice, he said, Miss Amelia saved us. Then he signed it too, for emphasis. Sheriff Dawson's expression softened. Boys, no one's taking anyone away. We just need to ensure everything is appropriate. Amelia stood then, moving with the quiet dignity that had characterized her from that first day at the depot. She wrote on her slate, handed it to the sheriff. He read aloud. I am happy to provide character references. Reverend Phillips knows me from church. Mrs. Henderson has visited twice this week. Dr. Miller can attest to the boys' improved spirits. References can be arranged, Garrett said dismissively. The fact remains, Caleb cut in, that you're not here about propriety or child welfare. You're here because Boone wants my water rights and thinks he can use intimidation to get them. Garrett's face flushed. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Morgan. It's a statement of fact. Caleb pulled out a document from the drawer of the side table. He'd been expecting something like this, though not so soon. This is the original land grant, properly filed and recorded. This is the water rights documentation, also properly filed. And this, he pulled out another paper, is the statement from Judge Hammond regarding Boone's previous attempt to claim adverse possession, which was denied. Sheriff Dawson looked relieved. Seems like everything is in order here, Mr. Garrett. But Garrett wasn't finished. There's still the matter of moral concern. The entire town is talking. An abandoned bride, a widower, 2 impressionable boys. The entire town, Amelia wrote on her slate, showing it to Dawson with steady hands. Consists of good people who judge by actions, not gossip. I invite anyone to observe my teaching, my conduct, and the boys' progress. She's right, Sheriff Dawson said, putting his hat back on with an air of finality. I've seen what I need to see. The boys are healthy, happy, and clearly learning. Miss Hart has proper private quarters. Unless Mr. Boone has evidence of actual wrongdoing, not speculation, not gossip, there's no issue here. Garrett's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. This isn't over. Mr. Boone has resources, and I have the law, Dawson interrupted, which I'm sworn to uphold fairly, not at the convenience of wealthy landowners. He turned to Caleb. You'll need to come to Fort Bryer in 2 weeks. There'll be a hearing, just a formality, but you should be there. Bring the boys, Miss Hart, and any witnesses you want. After they left, dust from their horses still settling, the four of them stood in the kitchen, processing what had happened. Amelia sank into a chair, hands trembling slightly now that the threat had passed. Jonah climbed into her lap without hesitation, arms wrapping around her neck. You won't leave? He asked, voice small. She hugged him tight, then signed, This is home. Eli stood beside them, his hand moving to rest on Amelia's shoulder the first time he'd voluntarily touched her. We won't let them take you, he said fiercely. Or the ranch. This is ours. Caleb watched his boys rally around this woman who'd brought light back to their darkness. We need to prepare, he said. Garrett was right about one thing. Boone has resources. We need witnesses, support from the town. Amelia wrote, I can teach at the schoolhouse. Show the town what I can do. That's good thinking. Caleb moved to the window, watching the dust trail from the departing horses. We'll visit the neighbors, too. Mrs. Henderson already thinks you hung the moon. Doc Miller keeps saying the boys are like different children. We are different, Eli said quietly. Better different. That evening, after supper, they sat around the table making plans. Amelia wrote lists in her neat script, potential witnesses, evidence to gather, people to visit. The boys contributed ideas. Jonah speaking, Eli mostly signing but occasionally adding verbal emphasis. Caleb pulled out the family Bible, thick with records of births and deaths, marriages and land transfers. This shows the ranch's history, 3 generations of Morgans on this land. Amelia pointed to Sarah's death date, then wrote, She would want the boys safe and happy. That matters more than gossip. Mama would like you, Jonah said suddenly. She liked meadowlarks too. Eli nodded, finally speaking the truth they'd all been dancing around. She would want us to be a family again, even if it looks different than before. Caleb's throat tightened. Then that's what we'll show them in Fort Bryer, that we're a family, unconventional as we might be. Amelia wrote one more thing, showing it to them all. Families aren't always born. Sometimes they're built from broken pieces that fit together in unexpected ways. The boys nodded solemnly. Outside, evening settled over Morgan Creek Ranch. But inside, 4 people who'd found each other across silence and sorrow began planning how to protect what they'd built. The threat from Boone and his lawyer had done something unexpected. It had transformed them from 4 individuals sharing a space into a united force. We should practice, Eli said. For the hearing, they'll have questions. So they did, late into the evening, preparing their defense with words and signs, building their case for a family that didn't look like others but worked in its own perfect way. When the lamps finally burned low, they said goodnight in signs and words, both knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges but facing them together. The spittoon by the door that Garrett had fastidiously avoided. The steel nib pen Amelia used for her lists. The pocket watch Caleb checked as the hour grew late. All the ordinary objects of their life seemed to promise permanence, defying anyone who had tried to tear apart what grief and kindness had built in this unlikely home. The wagon rolled into Red Hollow just after dawn, all four of them dressed in their Sunday best. Amelia had mended her torn wedding dress and dyed it a practical brown with walnut hulls, transforming it into something respectable. The boys sat straight-backed, hands practicing signs nervously. They had 1 week before the hearing, and every day counted. Their first stop was Doc Miller's office, a narrow building squeezed between the barbershop and the land office. The doctor emerged from examining old Mr. Pritchard's rheumatic knee, his medical bag in one hand, spectacles perched on his nose. He'd delivered both boys, had fought alongside Caleb to save Sarah when the fever took her. "Caleb," he said warmly, then noticed the boys' animated faces. "My word, Eli, Jonah, you look like different children entirely." "We are different," Jonah said clearly, then signed hello with perfect form. Doc Miller's eyebrows rose. "Is this Miss Hart's doing?" Amelia stepped forward, wrote on her slate, "The boys have learned over 50 signs. They're speaking again when they choose to. Remarkable." The doctor pulled out his ledger, the one where he kept medical records in meticulous detail. "I've been documenting their progress since you arrived, Miss Hart. The changes are, well, I'd call them miraculous if I didn't know they came from good teaching and patient care." He pulled out a sheet of paper, his fountain pen scratching across it. "I'll write this formally for the hearing. But let me say now, these boys were heading toward permanent silence, what we in the medical profession call selective mutism brought on by trauma. Miss Hart's intervention has been nothing short of therapeutic." Eli signed "thank you" with such sincerity that Doc Miller had to clean his spectacles, claiming dust. Next came the mercantile, where Mrs. Henderson held court among the pickle barrels and fabric bolts. She'd already gathered 3 other ranch wives, Mrs. Cooper, Mrs. Finch, and Mrs. Delacroix. They descended on Amelia like mother hens, examining her altered dress with approval, fussing over the boy's growth. "We've already written our statements," Mrs. Henderson announced, producing 4 sealed affidavits. "Any fool can see what you've done for this family. That Silas Boone should be ashamed, spreading his poison." "What's he saying?" Caleb asked. Though he could guess. Mrs. Cooper, a stout woman who'd raised 7 children, snorted. "The usual nonsense men spout when they want something they can't have. Says the arrangement is scandalous. Says a deaf woman can't properly supervise children." "Show them," Mrs. Finch urged Amelia. "Show them what you showed us yesterday." Amelia smiled, then signed rapidly to Jonah. He translated aloud. "Mrs. Henderson, would you please hand me the blue fabric, Mrs. Cooper? Could you check if the coffee grinder needs filling, Mrs. Finch? Is that a new shipment of preserving jars?" The women beamed. "She sees everything," Mrs. Delacroix said. "More than most people with perfect hearing. And the children she's been teaching." As if on cue, the door burst open and 6 children tumbled in, having spotted Eli and Jonah through the window. They ranged from little Mary Cooper, age 5, to Thomas Finch, 13. Without prompting, they lined up and signed "Good morning" in unison, their faces bright with pride. "Miss Amelia's been teaching them after regular school," Mrs. Henderson explained. 3 days now. Parents can't stop talking about it." Thomas Finch, a boy who'd always struggled with his letters, signed something complex. Eli translated. "He says learning signs helps him understand words better. The shapes make sense when sounds don't." Amelia wrote quickly. "Different minds learn differently. Sign language opens doors that spoken words sometimes can't." They spent an hour in the mercantile, the children demonstrating their signs, the mothers adding their testimonies to the growing pile of support. When they left, Mrs. Henderson pressed a peppermint stick into each boy's hand and a length of yellow ribbon into Amelia's, "For your hair at the hearing, dear." The schoolhouse sat at the town's edge, whitewashed and prim. Miss Thornton, the regular teacher, was marking slates when they arrived. She looked up with interest rather than suspicion. "I've heard about your lessons," she said to Amelia. "The children can't stop talking about them, ironically enough, given the subject matter." Amelia wrote, "Would you like to observe today's session?" I'd be honored. Within an hour, 14 children had gathered, word spreading like wildfire that Miss Amelia was teaching. They sat in neat rows, hands visible on their desks, eyes fixed on Amelia's graceful movements. She taught them friend, help, learn, building vocabulary that connected to their daily lives. When little Mary Cooper struggled with butterfly, Amelia knelt beside her, guiding her small hands patiently until she got it right. Miss Thornton took notes throughout, occasionally asking Eli or Jonah to translate a particularly complex sign. At the session's end, she stood. "I'll be testifying at the hearing," she announced. "This is education at its finest, inclusive, patient, and effective. Any community would be fortunate to have Miss Hart." Reverend Phillips was next, his small parsonage beside the church that Sarah had helped establish. He welcomed them warmly, though his eyes held concern. "I've heard Boone's been particularly vocal at the saloon." "What's he saying?" Caleb asked. "That you're living in sin, that the boys are being corrupted, that a proper Christian would have sent Miss Hart away immediately." The Reverend's jaw tightened. I reminded him that Christ himself welcomed those society rejected. He didn't appreciate the comparison. The Reverend pulled out his Bible, worn and well-loved. "I'll testify to Miss Hart's character and to the family's moral standing. But Caleb, you should know Boone's been buying drinks, spreading money around, trying to turn opinion." As if to confirm this, they could hear raucous laughter from the saloon 2 streets over. Boone's voice carried on the wind, whiskey-slurred but venomous. Amelia couldn't hear it, but she saw Caleb's face darken, saw both boys tense. She touched Caleb's arm gently. Signed, "Truth is stronger than lies." That afternoon, they visited the land office. Mr. Jameson, the clerk, was a methodical man who lived for properly filed documents. He pulled out survey maps, original claims, water rights documentation. Everything that proved the Morgan claim was ironclad. "Boone tried to file an adverse possession claim 3 years ago," Jameson noted, adjusting his spectacles. "Judge Hammond threw it out. He's trying a different angle now. But the law is clear. Your claim is solid." Caleb studied the surveys, noting something interesting. "This shows Boone's land borders mine at Willow Creek." "Yes, but water rights weren't included in his purchase. The previous owner retained them, then sold them to your father separately." Jameson pulled out another document. "Boone needs your water for his cattle operation to expand. Without it, he's landlocked during dry seasons." The picture became clearer. This wasn't about propriety or child welfare, it was about water, that most precious commodity in ranch country. They returned home as evening painted the sky purple and gold. The boys were exhausted, but exhilarated, full of stories about the town children learning signs, about Mrs. Henderson's fierce defense, about Doc Miller's kind words. After supper, they gathered around the table, coal oil lamps casting warm light on their work. Amelia organized the affidavits, testimonies, and documents into a leather portfolio. Caleb studied the land surveys, marking important boundaries. But the most important work happened between Eli and Jonah. "I want to speak at the hearing," Jonah announced. Eli nodded. "Me too. But we should write it first. Practice it." Amelia pushed paper and pencils toward them. For the next hour, she helped them craft their testimonies. Jonah's was simple but powerful. Miss Amelia brought sound back to our silent house, not with her voice, but with her hands and her heart. Eli's ran deeper, more complex. "After Mama died, we stopped talking because words hurt too much. Miss Amelia showed us a different way to speak, one that didn't betray Mama's memory. She made us a family again." As they worked, Caleb watched Amelia guide his boys with infinite patience. When Jonah struggled with spelling, she showed him how to fingerspell the word first, connecting the visual to the written. When Eli's emotions overwhelmed him, she simply sat beside him, present and steady until he could continue. The evening deepened. Jonah eventually fell asleep at the table, head pillowed on his half-finished testimony. As Caleb carried him to bed, he felt small arms tighten around his neck, heard a sleepy murmur, "Don't let them take her, Papa." "Never," Caleb promised. When he returned to the kitchen, Eli had gone to bed, leaving Caleb and Amelia alone with the lamplight and the night sounds of the ranch. She was still organizing papers, her face concentrated in the way that made a small line appear between her eyebrows. Caleb reached out, almost touched her hand, then pulled back, but she'd seen the movement. She looked up, and something passed between them, not quite spoken, not quite signed, but clear as any declaration. She wrote on her slate, "Whatever happens, I'm grateful. You gave me purpose when I had none." He took the chalk, wrote beneath her words, "You gave us life when we were merely existing." Their hands brushed as he returned the chalk. This time, neither pulled away. They sat in the lamplight, hands barely touching, building their case not just for the hearing, but for a future neither had expected, but both were beginning to hope for. Outside, coyotes called across the valley. Inside, the lamp wicks needed trimming. The testimonies needed final copying. Tomorrow's strategy needed planning. But for just this moment, they sat still. Two people who'd found each other across loss and silence, preparing to fight for the family they'd built from broken pieces. The portfolio of documents grew thicker: land surveys, testimonies, affidavits, medical statements, but the real evidence couldn't be captured on paper: the sound of Jonah's laughter, Eli's protective courage, the way Amelia's presence had transformed their house back into a home, the way Caleb's heart had begun to hope again. Boone could spread his poison, hire his lawyers, waive his money, but he couldn't touch what they'd built here in the lamplight, a family bound not by convention, but by choice, not by blood, but by the daily decision to show up for each other, to speak in whatever language they could share, to face the world together. Tomorrow would bring more preparation, more gathering of support. But tonight, in the gentle glow of coal oil lamps, with testimonies spread across the pine table and hands finally brave enough to touch, they were already victorious. The hearing would merely confirm what they'd proven to themselves, that love speaks in many languages, and family takes many forms, and sometimes the best things come from the most unexpected beginnings. The morning before the hearing dawned wrong. Caleb knew it the moment he stepped outside. The cattle were lowing in distress, milling near the eastern boundary instead of grazing peacefully. He saddled his horse quickly, dread pooling in his stomach. Eli appeared at the barn door, still in his nightshirt. "Something's wrong with the fence," Caleb said. "Wake your brother. Keep him and Miss Amelia inside until I get back." But Eli was already running toward the house, bare feet kicking up dust. Caleb rode hard toward the disturbance, finding what he'd feared: 3 sections of barbed wire fence cut clean through, posts pushed over, 20 head of cattle already straying onto Boone's land. The cuts were fresh, metal gleaming where wire cutters had done their work in the night. He spent 2 hours rounding up the strays, temporary mending the fence with what wire he could salvage. By the time he returned, Amelia had breakfast waiting, but her face was pale. She'd already understood this was escalation. "Boone's getting desperate," Caleb said, accepting coffee with hands that shook from anger, not exhaustion. "The hearing's tomorrow. He's trying to provoke something." Eli's jaw clenched. "We should ride into town. Tell the sheriff." "That's what he wants," Caleb replied. "Me to come in angry, make a scene, give him ammunition for tomorrow." He looked at Amelia. "I need to go to town anyway. Pick up the last affidavits. You 3 stay here." Amelia shook her head, wrote quickly, "Safer together." She was right. Leaving them alone at the ranch now felt dangerous. They hitched the wagon, loaded it with the rifle cleaned and loaded but hopefully unnecessary. The Colt .45 rested heavy on Caleb's hip. He hated wearing it, hadn't since Sarah's funeral, but these were different times. The ride to town felt longer than usual. Every shadow could hide one of Boone's men. Every rider in the distance made them tense. The boys sat close to Amelia, Jonah's hand in hers, Eli scanning the horizon like a soldier. Red Hollow's main street buzzed with unusual activity for a weekday. They soon saw why Boone stood outside the saloon, holding court with 5 hired hands. Not local men. These, They had the look of Denver trouble, maybe even further east, gun hands, though their weapons stayed holstered. For now, one of them, a scarred man with dead eyes, stepped into the street as their wagon passed. He didn't block them. Exactly. But his presence made the horses nervous. He tipped his hat mockingly at Amelia. "Heard there's going to be quite a show tomorrow," he said, voice carrying. "Shame if someone couldn't make it." Caleb's hand moved toward his Colt, but Amelia touched his arm. Her eyes said everything. Don't give them what they want. They continued to the Mercantile, where Mrs. Henderson waited with a face like thunder. "Those men have been making threats all morning," she said, "telling folks that anyone who testifies tomorrow might find their fences cut too, or worse." "How many are backing out?" Caleb asked. "None yet," Mrs. May Henderson said firmly. "We're not so easily cowed. But Caleb, be careful. Boone's different this time. More desperate." They collected the remaining affidavits. 3 more families had written statements of support. Doc Miller had added a second medical opinion. Even Mr. Jameson from the land office had prepared additional documentation. The leather portfolio grew heavier with evidence, but Caleb's heart grew heavier too. All this support, and still Boone persisted. What would it take to end this? As they prepared to leave town, Reverend Phillips hurried over. "I've been praying on this," he said. "Tomorrow's about more than land or propriety. It's about what kind of community we want to be. One ruled by money and intimidation, or one built on compassion and justice." The ride home was silent except for the wagon wheels and horse hooves. Even Jonah didn't chatter, sensing the tension. As they crested the hill to Morgan Creek Ranch, Caleb's heart sank. Fresh marks in the dirt showed multiple horses had been there. Nothing damaged that he could see, but the message was clear. We can reach you anywhere. That evening, Amelia barely touched her supper. She excused herself early, going to her room. The boys picked at their food, anxiety-killing appetite. When Caleb checked on her an hour later, he found what he'd feared most: she was packing her trunk. She looked up as he entered, tears streaming down her face. Her hands moved to sign, but he understood without translation. She thought she was bringing danger to them, that leaving would keep them safe. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides, sat heavily on the bed beside her trunk. His hands felt clumsy as he signed the words he'd been practicing in secret, the ones Eli had taught him: please, stay, home. She shook her head, pointed to the cut fence visible through the window, to the boys' room where they pretended to sleep but certainly listened. He tried again, mixing spoken words with signs, not caring if he got them wrong. "We need you. I need you. This is your home, our home," she wrote on her slate, hand shaking. "They could hurt the boys because of me." "They could hurt the boys to get the ranch," he countered. "This isn't about you. It's about water and land and a greedy man who thinks money buys everything." He took the chalk, wrote slowly, "You leaving won't stop him. It will only break us." The door creaked open. Jonah stood there in his nightshirt, Eli behind him. Without words, they crossed to Amelia, Jonah climbing into her lap, Eli sitting on her other side. "If you leave, I'll never speak again," Jonah said solemnly. "Not ever." Eli's hands moved fluently. "You taught us that family stays together. That's what family does." Caleb watched her resolve crumble. She held Jonah tighter, reached for Eli's hand. Finally, she nodded. She would stay. They would face tomorrow together. They moved to the parlor, all 4 of them unwilling to separate. The family Bible sat open on the table, recording generations of Morgans who'd fought for this land. Caleb added wood to the stove, though the night was warm, needing the light more than heat. "We should practice once more," Eli said, pulling out his testimony. So they did, by the light of kerosene lanterns, each taking turns. Jonah's words came clear and strong. "Miss Amelia saved us." Eli's ran deeper. "She showed us how to live again, not just survive." Amelia wrote her own statement for someone to read aloud, probably Mrs. Henderson, who'd volunteered. It was simple, dignified. I came here broken and lost. This family gave me purpose. I've done nothing improper, nothing shameful. I've simply tried to help two boys find their voices again, in whatever form those voices take. Caleb practiced his own words, though they felt inadequate. How could he explain to a judge what Amelia meant to them, how she'd taken their shattered pieces and patiently, carefully, helped them rebuild? How her presence had transformed duty into joy, silence into communication, a house into a home. The rocking chair creaked as Amelia settled into it. Jonah still in her lap. He was fighting sleep, desperate to stay awake, to not miss anything. Caleb pulled out his pocket knife and a piece of pine, began whittling to keep his hands busy. Eli read from the Bible, his voice steady. Psalm 23, Sarah's favorite. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, Eli read, I will fear no evil. Jonah's breathing deepened. He'd lost his battle with sleep, small body relaxing completely in Amelia's arms. She stroked his hair gently, and Caleb saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer or a promise. The clock on the mantel, Sarah's grandmother's clock from Boston, ticked toward midnight. Tomorrow would come whether they were ready or not. The judge would listen to their case, to Boone's lies, and make a decision that would shape their future. Whatever happens, Caleb said quietly, we did this right. We stayed together. We didn't let him provoke us into violence or make us compromise who we are. Eli closed the Bible, moved to sit near his father. Mama would be proud, he said, of all of us, of what we've become. Amelia signed something Caleb had learned to recognize, thank you. They sat in the lamplight, reluctant to separate, to let this night end, because tomorrow would bring judgment, one way or another. Either they would be validated as a family, unconventional but legitimate, or they would be torn apart by law and propriety and one man's greed. The lanterns burned low. Jonah shifted in his sleep, murmuring something that sounded like home. Amelia's hands stilled on his hair. Eli's eyes grew heavy despite his determination to stay alert. And Caleb sat watching over them all, his makeshift family, his unexpected blessing, ready to fight with every legal weapon at his disposal to keep them together. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. But inside, in the circle of dying lamplight, they were safe. For these last few hours before dawn, before court, before whatever came next, they were simply what they'd worked so hard to become, a family. Different from what any of them had planned or expected, but no less real for its unlikely beginning. The cut fence could be repaired. Boone's threats could be faced. The court's decision could be appealed if necessary. But this moment of the four of them together, choosing each other despite fear and uncertainty, this was already victory. Tomorrow would simply be about making the rest of the world see what they already knew, that love comes in many languages, family takes many forms, and sometimes the greatest strength comes from admitting you need help, need each other, need the unexpected grace that walks through your door in a torn wedding dress and teaches you to speak with your hands and your heart. The courthouse in Fort Bryer stood like a monument to civilization's reach into frontier territory, red brick and white columns, 3 stories of deliberate grandeur. By 9 o'clock, every bench in the gallery was occupied. The entire population of Red Hollow seemed to have made the journey, along with curious citizens of Fort Bryer who'd heard about the unusual case. Brass spittoons gleamed at the end of each row, recently polished for the occasion. Judge Cornelius Hammond entered precisely at 9:30, his black robe sweeping behind him. He was a small man made larger by reputation, 30 years of fair judgments, immune to bribery or intimidation. His gavel, carved from native oak, cracked once against the bench. This hearing concerns the welfare and living arrangements of the minor children Eli and Jonah Morgan, and the fitness of their current situation. His voice carried without shouting, years of practice projecting authority. Mr. Garrett, you represent the complainant. Garrett rose from his table, every inch the Denver lawyer in his pressed suit and waxed mustache. Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Silas Boone brings these concerns as a civic duty, worried for the moral welfare of two motherless boys. Caleb sat at the opposite table with Amelia and the boys. They'd managed to secure James Morrison from Fort Briar, an older lawyer who specialized in land disputes but had taken their case for principle rather than profit. Morrison was weathered as old leather, but his eyes were sharp as steel. Mr. Morrison, you represent the Morgan family. I do, Your Honor, and we're prepared to demonstrate that Mr. Boone's concerns are not only unfounded, but motivated entirely by his desire to acquire Morgan Creek Ranch and its water rights. Objection, Garrett said smoothly. Mr. Boone's motivations are irrelevant to the children's welfare. Sustained, Judge Hammond ruled. Let's focus on the matter at hand. Mr. Garrett, present your case. Garrett stood, beginning his performance. Your Honor, we have a situation of grave impropriety. A young woman of questionable reputation abandoned at the altar, which raises questions about her character living unchaperoned with a widower and his impressionable sons. Furthermore, this woman is deaf, unable to hear if the children cry for help, unable to respond to emergencies. He paced before the bench, warming to his theme. What kind of example does this set? What are we teaching these boys about proper relationships between men and women? And, practically speaking, how can a deaf woman adequately supervise children? What if there's a fire, a medical emergency, an accident at the ranch? Is Miss Hart present? Judge Hammond asked. Amelia stood, dignified in her brown dress with the yellow ribbon. Mrs. Henderson had given her woven through her braided hair. She signed, "Yes, Your Honor," and Mrs. Henderson, sitting directly behind her, translated aloud. I see, the judge said, interest flickering in his eyes. Continue, Mr. Garrett. We call Mr. Silas Boone to testify. Boone took the witness chair like he owned it, his expensive suit and gold watch chain catching the light from the tall windows. Oil paintings of Presidents Lincoln and Grant seemed to frown down at him. Mr. Morgan approached me last month, Boone lied smoothly, asking if I'd buy his ranch, said he couldn't manage it alone with the boys. When I hesitated, suddenly this woman appears, clearly a scheme to make the ranch seem viable, to drive up the price. That's a lie. Jonah's voice rang out before anyone could stop him. Judge Hammond's gavel cracked. Young man, you'll have your turn to speak if called upon. Morrison rose. Your Honor, we have documents proving Mr. Boone approached Mr. Morgan repeatedly about purchasing the ranch, not the other way around. We'll see those documents in due course. Mr. Boone, continue. Boone painted a picture of scandal and impropriety, his voice oily with false concern. The court stenographer's pen scratched steadily, recording every poisonous word. When he finished, several people in the gallery were frowning, doubt creeping in despite what they knew. Cross-examination, Mr. Morrison, the old lawyer approached slowly, like a cat stalking prey. Mr. Boone, you own the ranch adjacent to Morgan Creek. I do. And your cattle operation requires water access. All ranches do. But your land grant didn't include water rights to Willow Creek, did it? Boone's face reddened slightly. That's not relevant. Answer the question. No, it didn't. Morrison pulled out a surveyor's map, submitted it as evidence. This shows your land becomes essentially worthless during drought years without access to Morgan Creek's water. Isn't that true? Objection, Garrett called. Relevance. It goes to motivation, Your Honor. Morrison replied. Mr. Boone needs the Morgan Ranch for his business, not out of concern for children. I'll allow it. Answer the question. Mr. Boone? Through 15 minutes of careful questions, Morrison dismantled Boone's testimony, revealing contradictions, motivations, and outright lies. By the time Boone stepped down, his face was flushed, his composure cracked. Call your witnesses, Mr. Morrison. What followed was a parade of support that filled the courtroom with warmth. Doc Miller testified first, his medical opinion carrying weight. These boys were heading toward permanent selective mutism. Miss Hart's intervention has been nothing short of therapeutic. I've documented their improvement extensively. He produced his medical ledger, showing detailed notes over the past month. They're speaking again, Your Honor, laughing, playing, acting like children should act. Mrs. Henderson testified next, her voice ringing with righteousness. I've visited that ranch weekly since Miss Hart arrived. Everything is proper. She has separate quarters. More importantly, she's brought joy back to that home. Those boys adore her appropriately, as students adore a good teacher. And the deaf issue, Judge Hammond asked. Your Honor, may I demonstrate something? At the judge's nod, Mrs. Henderson had 3 children from the gallery come forward. These young ones have been learning sign language from Miss Hart. Children, show His Honor how you'd alert someone to danger without sound. Little Mary Cooper signed frantically danger, fire, help, her face animated with mock urgency. The meaning was crystal clear even to those who didn't know signs. Miss Hart sees everything, Mrs. Henderson continued. She noticed young Tommy Finch had a fever before his own mother did, just from watching him move differently. Being deaf hasn't made her less capable, it's made her more observant. Reverend Phillips testified to character and moral standing. Miss Thornton, the schoolteacher, praised Amelia's educational methods. Mr. Jameson presented land documents proving Boone's previous attempts to claim the Morgan Ranch through questionable means. Then Morrison called Amelia herself. She stood gracefully, and Mrs. Henderson moved to stand beside her as interpreter. Through Mrs. Henderson's voice, Amelia's words filled the courtroom. I came to Red Hollow broken and lost. The Morgan family gave me purpose, dignity, and yes, a home. I've done nothing improper. I've maintained appropriate boundaries while helping 2 traumatized children find their voices again. She signed as Mrs. Henderson spoke, her hands painting meaning in the air. I may not hear with my ears, but I listen with my eyes, my heart, my full attention. These boys were drowning in silence. I simply offered them a different way to breathe. Your Honor, Morrison said, we have one more piece of evidence. The boys themselves would like to address the court. Garrett jumped up. Objection? Children can't testify in matters of their own welfare. They don't understand the implications. These boys understand plenty, Morrison countered. They're not testifying to legal matters, but to their own experience. Judge Hammond considered. The gallery held its breath. I'll allow it, but keep it brief. Eli stood first, his voice clear and strong. Your Honor, Miss Amelia didn't just teach us sign language. She taught us it was okay to communicate again, that finding our voices didn't betray our mother's memory. She made us a family again. Then Jonah did something that made the entire courtroom gasp. He pulled a chair to the center of the floor, climbed onto it so everyone could see him, and began signing with passionate intensity while Eli translated. Miss Amelia taught us to smile again. She is our family now, not because of blood or law, but because she chose to stay when we were difficult and sad. She chose to learn our sadness and teach us joy. Please don't take her away. Please don't break our family because it doesn't look like others think it should. His small hands flew through the signs, his face fierce with determination. When he finished, he spoke aloud, his voice ringing, She is home, we are home, together. The gallery erupted. Several women were crying openly. Men cleared their throats suspiciously. Even the bailiff, a tough former cavalry soldier, seemed to have something in his eye. Judge Hammond gavelled for order. Mr. Garrett, any rebuttal? Garrett stood, but his theatrical confidence had evaporated. The room's emotion was palpable, the community's support overwhelming. Your Honor, regardless of sentiment, the law is clear about propriety. The law, Judge Hammond interrupted, is concerned with the welfare of children. I've seen no evidence of impropriety, neglect, or harm. What I've seen is a community rallying around a family that's healing from tragedy. He looked directly at Boone. What I've also seen is an attempt to use the law for personal gain, to manipulate concern for children into a land grab. Mr. Boone, if you bring another frivolous complaint before this court, I'll investigate your business practices thoroughly. Do I make myself clear? Boone's face went purple, but he nodded. As for the matter at hand, Judge Hammond continued, I find no reason to interfere with the current arrangements at Morgan Creek Ranch. Miss Hart has proven herself capable, moral, and beneficial to the children's welfare. The unconventional nature of the arrangement is irrelevant if it serves the children's best interests. He paused, looking at Amelia. Miss Hart, you mentioned being abandoned at the altar. The man who left you is a fool. These boys and their father are fortunate to have found you, and you them. The gavel came down with finality. Case dismissed. Court is adjourned. The courtroom exploded in celebration. The boys flew to Amelia, embracing her from both sides. Caleb stood behind them, his hand finding Amelia's shoulder, squeezing gently in victory and gratitude. Boone stormed out, Garrett trailing behind, their defeat complete and public. Morrison shook Caleb's hand, grinning. Sometimes the law actually serves justice. Today was one of those times. The community of Red Hollow surrounded them, offering congratulations, admiration, support. The children from town signed congratulations to Amelia, their faces beaming. Doc Miller clapped Caleb on the back. Reverend Phillips offered a blessing. As they finally made their way to the wagon for the journey home, Judge Hammond appeared on the courthouse steps. He caught Caleb's eye and nodded once acknowledgement, approval, and perhaps something more. Understanding that families come in many forms, that love speaks many languages, and that sometimes the greatest courage is simply choosing to stay, to try, to build something beautiful from broken pieces. The wagon rolled out of Fort Bryer with 4 people who'd entered as the arrangement of convenience and necessity, but left as something more. The boys chattered excitedly, mixing speech and signs, retelling their favorite moments from the hearing. Amelia's eyes shone with tears she wouldn't let fall. Not yet. Not until they were home. And Caleb drove toward Morgan Creek Ranch knowing that tomorrow the sun would rise on a family that had been tested and proven true. Not in spite of their differences, but because of how those differences had made them stronger, more complete, more wholly themselves. The brass spittoons would be emptied. The judge's gavel would rest silent until the next case. The court stenographer's record would be filed away. But what happened in that courtroom would ripple through the community for years the day 2 boys stood up for love, the day a woman's worth was measured by her heart rather than her hearing, the day a family was validated not by convention, but by the simple, powerful truth of their commitment to each other. The wagon ride home from Fort Bryer stretched through afternoon light that painted the sage and rabbit brush gold. Nobody spoke for the first mile, each of them holding the victory close like something fragile that might shatter if handled roughly. Jonah sat between Caleb and Amelia on the bench seat, his small hand in hers, occasionally signing happy just because he could. Eli rode in the wagon bed, back against the sideboard, face turned to the sky with an expression of profound relief. When they crested the hill that brought Morgan Creek Ranch into view, Caleb felt Amelia's sharp intake of breath. The ranch looked different somehow, not physically changed, but transformed by what had happened in that courtroom. It was truly, legally, unquestionably home now, for all of them. Blue and Patch came running, tails wagging furiously, as if they sensed the change in the air. The evening chores waited horses to feed, cattle to check, eggs to gather, but for once, Caleb didn't immediately head to work. Instead, they sat on the porch, all 4 of them, watching the sun set behind the mesa while meadowlarks sang their evening songs. "We won," Jonah said wonderingly, as if saying it might make it more real. Then he signed it, his hands sure and graceful. "We won. We're a family." Amelia's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back all day. Caleb reached over Jonah's head, his calloused hand finding hers. She turned her palm up, their fingers interlacing naturally, inevitably. Eli saw the gesture and smiled, the first full, unguarded smile Caleb had seen from his older son since Sarah's death. That evening, supper was a celebration. Supper. Caleb had stopped at the Mercantile on the way home, buying white flour instead of cornmeal, fresh butter, a jar of preserved strawberries. Amelia made biscuits light as clouds. The boys chattered through the meal, mixing signs and words in a jumbled language all their own. The coal oil lamps seemed to burn brighter, the kitchen warmer, the whole house humming with possibility. After dishes were done, all of them working together in practice synchronization. Caleb cleared his throat. The boys looked up expectantly. Amelia tilted her head, reading his face with that uncanny perception she possessed. "We need to talk about the future," he said, signing the words he knew as he spoke them. "About what comes next." Jonah's face fell. "Miss Amelia's staying, isn't she?" The judge said. "Of course I'm staying," Caleb said quickly. "But how she stays, that needs discussing." Amelia's cheeks flushed pink. She understood. Her hands moved to speak, but Caleb caught them gently in his own. "Let me," he said softly, then turned to his boys. "How would you feel if Miss Amelia wasn't just your teacher, if she became more—" "You mean marry her?" Jonah asked with a child's directness. "Make her our mother." The word hung in the air like a held breath. Mother? Such a loaded term, carrying grief and hope in equal measure. Eli spoke carefully. "Mama would want us happy. She'd want Papa happy." He looked at Amelia. "You make us happy. You make us whole." Amelia's tears fell freely now. She signed something complex and beautiful. And Eli translated, "You three made me whole too. You gave me family when I thought I'd lost my chance at one." "Is that a yes?" Jonah demanded, bouncing in his chair. Amelia laughed, that rare, lovely sound she made despite not hearing it herself. She nodded, signed yes repeatedly, then wrote on her slate, "If you'll have me, all three of you." "Yes!" Jonah shouted, launching himself at her. Eli joined the embrace more sedately but no less warmly. Caleb wrapped his arms around all of them, his family, complete and complicated and perfect in its imperfection. 3 months passed in a blur of preparation and change. Word of the engagement spread through Red Hollow like wildfire. Mrs. Henderson took charge of wedding preparations with military precision. The women of the town descended on the ranch with fabric and suggestions, turning Amelia's simple request for a small ceremony into a community celebration. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, unusual for late autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek had turned gold, their leaves shimmering like nature's wedding decoration. Caleb had built an arbor of willow branches, which the boys had decorated with late-blooming wild asters and sage. In her room, soon to be the sewing room once she moved into the main house, Amelia stood before the small mirror while Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Cooper fussed with her dress. It was cream muslin, simple but elegant, with tiny pearl buttons down the back that Mrs. Henderson had donated from her own wedding dress. The torn wedding dress hung on its peg, a reminder of the journey that had brought her here. "You're radiant." Mrs. Henderson signed. She'd been learning diligently these 3 months. Many in the town had, creating a community where Amelia could communicate freely. Amelia's wildflower bouquet gathered by the boys that morning contained meadow asters, rabbit brush, and a single late rose from Sarah's garden. She'd worried about that, about stepping into Sarah's place, but Eli had been the one to cut the rose, pressing it into her hand with a smile. Outside, the ranch transformed. Tables made from sawhorses and planks stretched across the yard, covered with tablecloths the churchwomen had brought. The barn was swept clean for dancing later. Reverend Philip stood under the willow arbor, his Bible in hand. Nearly all of Red Hollow had come, along with friends from Fort Bryer, even Judge Hammond, who'd made the journey specially. The ceremony began when Doc Miller's fiddle sang out the first notes of a hymn. Jonah walked first, carrying the rings on a cushion Mrs. Cooper had embroidered. He wore his Sunday best with a new collar Amelia had sewn, his face serious with the responsibility of his role. Behind him came Eli, tall and solemn, standing as Caleb's best man. At 12, he was stretching toward manhood, but his eyes still held that mix of child and adult that came from growing up too fast. Then came Amelia, and the entire gathering seemed to inhale collectively. She walked alone. She'd insisted on it. No one was giving her away. She was choosing this, walking toward her family with steady steps and eyes that held Caleb's across the distance. Caleb stood transfixed. She was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was theirs, his, the boys, this remarkable woman who'd transformed their grief into growth, their silence into symphony. Reverend Philip spoke about love that transcends circumstance, about families formed by choice, about God's mysterious ways of healing broken hearts. When it came time for vows, Amelia had written hers, and Mrs. Henderson read them aloud while Amelia signed, "Caleb, Eli, Jonah, you saved me when I thought I was lost. You gave me purpose when I had none. I promise to love you, to stand with you, to speak with you in whatever language we share. I promise to honor Sarah's memory by loving her boys as my own. I promise to make our home a place of laughter and learning, of safety and joy." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion as he spoke his vows, signing the words he knew. "Amelia, you brought light back to our darkness. You taught us that love speaks many languages, that families take many forms. I promise to cherish you, to protect you, to learn your language as you've learned ours. I promise to build our future while honoring our past." When Reverend Phillips pronounced them married, when Caleb kissed his bride while the crowd erupted in celebration, Jonah's clear laughter rang out above everything else. He ran to them, signing "I love you" with perfect clarity, adding aloud, "Mama Amelia." The name had been his idea, discussed solemnly with Eli the week before, not replacing their first mother, but acknowledging their second. Amelia had cried when they'd asked if she'd accept the title. The celebration that followed was legendary in Red Hollow's history. Doc Miller's fiddle was joined by Tom Finch's guitar and someone's accordion. The barn dance went on until midnight, with even the children learning to dance to music they couldn't hear but could feel through the floor. The wedding cake, brought by Mrs. Henderson and decorated with crystallized violets, stood 3 layers tall. Silas Boone was notably absent, having sold his ranch the month before and left for Denver, without water rights. His land had indeed proved worthless for cattle. The new owner, a young couple from Kansas, had already approached Caleb about sharing water access fairly. As evening deepened, a photographer from Fort Bryer arranged the family for a formal portrait. They stood before the house, Caleb and Amelia seated, the boys standing behind them. But after that formal image, Jonah demanded another. In this one, they were laughing. Hands mid-sign, Jonah on Amelia's lap, Eli's hand on his father's shoulder. A family caught in a moment of pure joy. The guests gradually departed, leaving gifts practical and heartfelt, preserving jars, new fabric, a set of Sunday dishes, a cradle that made Amelia blush and Caleb grin. The boys helped clear tables until Amelia shooed them to bed, her first act of maternal authority that made them grin even as they obeyed. Finally, as the moon rose full and bright, Caleb and Amelia stood alone on the porch. The ranch was quiet except for the normal night sounds, coyotes in the distance, the creek murmuring, an owl calling from the cottonwoods. "No regrets?" Caleb asked, signing as he spoke. Amelia shook her head, then signed something Eli had recently taught him. Perfect, home, family, complete. Inside, they checked on the boys one last time. Both were deeply asleep, exhausted from the day's excitement. Jonah had fallen asleep, signing his hands frozen mid-gesture on his pillow. Eli had his mother's Bible on his nightstand. A bookmark at Corinthians: "Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things." The next morning brought the gentle chaos of a family finding its new rhythm. Breakfast was late, the boys giggling at this breach of routine. Amelia moved about the kitchen not as guest or employee, but as wife, mother, the heart of the home. Her trunk had been moved into the main bedroom. Her few possessions had found their places among Caleb's things. When Jonah asked if things would be different now, Amelia signed, "Different, yes, better different." And it was. The ranch thrived under their combined care. The boys grew strong and confident, fluent in both spoken and signed language. The community of Red Hollow gradually learned signs too, creating an inclusive world where Amelia could fully participate. Winter came with its challenges, but the house was warm with more than wood fire. Spring brought new calves, a larger garden, hope planted deep as seeds. By summer, when Amelia's condition became obvious, the boys were beside themselves with excitement about a sibling. The torn wedding dress was eventually cut up for quilt squares. Incorporated into a new pattern Amelia designed, broken pieces made beautiful. past and present stitched together into something useful and lovely. She worked on it in the evenings while Caleb read aloud, the boys sprawled on the rug doing homework, the coal oil lamps casting golden light on a family that had learned to speak every language love requires. The last square she added contained a meadowlark embroidered in yellow thread, Sarah's favorite bird, now Amelia's too, a symbol of how families blend and grow, how loss becomes not an ending but a transformation, how sometimes the most beautiful songs come from the most unexpected voices. Morgan Creek Ranch stood testament to a truth the frontier taught daily: families aren't always born from blood or convention. They're forged in moments of desperate choice, when strangers become salvation, when silence finds its voice through unexpected teachers. Caleb had learned that gratitude wasn't just for abundance, it was for the broken souls who arrived in torn wedding dresses, for boys brave enough to speak again, for communities that chose compassion over gossip. Amelia taught them that communication transcends sound, that love needs no perfect words, only willing hearts and patient hands. The boys discovered that honoring their first mother didn't mean rejecting their second. Sarah's memory lived in the roses by her grave, in the Bible they still read, in the love that had prepared their hearts to accept more. Amelia didn't replace, she expanded, showing them that families can grow from loss, that joy and grief can coexist like harmony in a song. Their victory in court proved something vital when communities stand together against greed and prejudice. When they defend love in all its forms, justice prevails. Every sign the town learned, every testimony given, declared that family is defined by choice, commitment, and courage. Have you ever watched someone judge your unconventional family, or try to tear apart something beautiful just because it didn't match their narrow definition of proper?